Welcome, everyone. This is part 3 in our series on presenting your research. We're going to be talking about the sometimes thrilling and sometimes agonizing process of submitting your work for publication at an NLP conference. To start, I want to review what's known as the anonymity period for ACL conferences. All of the ACL conferences have adopted a uniform policy that submitted papers cannot be uploaded to repositories like arXiv or made public in other ways, starting 1 month from the submission deadline and extending through the time when decisions go out. So you should be aware of this, and for specific conferences, check their sites for the precise date when the embargo goes into effect so that you're sure you're playing by the rules. The rationale, the policy is an attempt to balance the benefits of free and fast distribution of new ideas against the benefits of double-blind peer review. The idea is that we want to avoid corrupting reviewers just at the moment that they sit down to begin their work of reviewing by having them see on arXiv or via Twitter an announcement about the paper they're reviewing that reveals the authors and the origins and so forth, because we know that that public announcement would influence their decision-making process. So to kind of preserve that, but balance that against free dissemination of ideas, we have this embargo period around the period when we know reviewing will happen. For more on the policy and its rationale, you can follow this link here, but I would say that fundamentally it's an attempt to balance these two pressures, a kind of pragmatic approach to balancing them. Okay, now let's dive into the actual process of submitting work for publication and having it go through review at one of these conferences. So to start, let's suppose you've submitted your paper. When you do that, you'll select some area keywords that will help determine which committee gets your paper. This is already a really important step. You'll be choosing from a bunch of keywords that signal different areas of NLP. And what you're doing at that point is probably routing your paper to certain sets of reviewers and certain area chairs and so forth. And in doing that, you're creating expectations about the kind of contribution that you're making. So if you're unsure about this process, I would encourage you to recruit an expert in the NLP reviewing process to help you make these keyword selections. Here's an example of how this could be important. Suppose that your paper is fundamentally a new machine learning contribution, but it reports some experiments that involve kind of topics in computational social science. It might be really a mistake to choose the computational social science keyword at this point, because if your paper ends up with reviewers who have expectations that you'll be making some new and fundamental contribution to that area, and what they're looking at is a machine learning contribution, that mismatch in their expectations might lead them to have a negative perception of the work. And the reverse, of course, holds as well. If you have a fundamentally new computational social sciences contribution, but it incidentally makes use of some machine learning apparatus, I think it would be a mistake to choose machine learning as a keyword precisely because of that mismatch in expectations that would result in reviewers' minds when they sat down and started reviewing your paper. So think strategically about this stage. You can see why it's important at this next stage here. Reviewers, when they begin their work, they're going to first scan a long list of titles and abstracts, and they'll make bids on which ones they want to do. At this point, they signal yes or maybe or no, or maybe they indicate a conflict of interests, indicating that they can't review the paper at all. When they do this, the title is probably the primary factor in bidding decisions. They probably have access to the abstract at this stage, but they might be looking at a list of over 200 different contributions, and it's probably just too much to ask that they would read all of these abstracts at this stage. So they're probably scanning the title and using that as an indication about what kind of bids they want to make. So again, you might think strategically about your title and the role it will play at this early stage in the process. After that, the program chairs assign reviewers their papers, partly based on the bidding, but maybe partly based on other considerations of workloads and so forth. We don't know precisely how that process will happen, but by some mechanism, your paper will be assigned probably 3 different reviewers. Reviewers read the papers, write comments, and supply ratings over the course of a few months. At the very end of that process, authors are typically allowed to respond briefly to the reviews. And then the program chair or the area chair might seek to simulate some discussion among the reviewers about conflicts between their reviews, or maybe places where the author response says the reviewers are incorrect or misguided or something. We hope that that's a lively and rich discussion about the paper that's led by open-minded people who are just trying to arrive at the best possible recommendation for your paper. That's what we hope at this stage in the process. Then finally, at the very end, the program committee is going to do some magic to arrive at the final program based on all of this input. Of course, the reviews and ratings will be a major factor, but there might be other considerations that they bring in at this stage in terms of constructing a diverse and interesting program for their conference. At this stage, you might get a meta review that provides some insight into the final decision-making process, although those vary in the amount that they actually illuminate the behind-the-scenes process that led to the particular recommendation that was made by the reviewers and area chair. In terms of the work that the actual reviewers are doing, I would say that the current ACL setup is kind of oriented around structured text for the reviews, as opposed to providing a lot of metadata via ratings. So first, they'll probably be asked to just indicate what the paper is about, what contributions it makes, and what its main strengths and weaknesses are. This is a kind of check that they actually understand what's in the paper and can articulate what's in the paper, and it gives a first indication of their assessment. Next, you have reasons to accept and reasons to reject. Then there could be a section for additional questions and feedback for the authors. Maybe the reviewers can indicate missing references, and maybe also a catch-all section for typos, grammar, style, and presentation improvements, and so forth. Then, of course, you get two really important ratings, the overall recommendation, and maybe an assessment of the reviewer's confidence in their overall evaluation. And then finally, there could be a section for confidential information that the reviewers want to communicate directly to the program committee. That would be hidden from the authors as well as the other reviewers. So stepping back, the most important pieces of this reviewing form are obviously the overall recommendation, possibly balanced against reviewer confidence, and the reasons to accept and reasons to reject. You can count on the two texts that they supply under 2 and 3 here as being really important to shaping the discussion that happens and the overall recommendation that gets made. There's an author response period for at least the major ACL conferences. This is a chance for authors to submit short responses to the reviews. This is a rather uncertain business along many dimensions, so let me just offer some thoughts. First, many people are cynical about author responses since they've observed that reviewers rarely change their scores afterwards, and I think that is an important consideration. However, it might just be bad signaling not to submit a response at all. It could incidentally indicate to the program committee that you've kind of silently opted out of the process, so its mere absence could reduce your chances of getting accepted, I believe. More positively, for conferences that have area chairs, and I believe all of the current major ACL conferences do, the author response could be really important. An area chair is someone who's tasked with stimulating discussion and writing meta reviews for a small number of papers, maybe 5 to 20, depending on the conference volume. And for those people, the author response might have a major impact. I've played the role of area chair many times, and the author responses are always valuable to me. It's another text alongside the reviews that the reviewers provided, and it helps me understand places of conflict, places where the authors differ in their perspective from the reviewers, and so forth. It is always extremely valuable evidence to me. And I think that holds for many area chairs. And for this reason alone, you might think about submitting a detailed author response with these area chairs in mind as your primary readers. NLP conferences, for better or worse, have very complex rules about what you can and can't say in these author responses. Sometimes you can't report any new results. Sometimes you have to be very circumspect about what kind of results you have, and so forth. If you have questions about what you can do in a particular case, seek out an expert at Stanford for advice on how to interpret the precise rules and what kind of leeway you actually have in saying what you think is important to say. I think all of these restrictions are kind of unfortunate. When I play the role of area chair and as reviewer, I would simply like to have access to all the information that I can possibly obtain. And so I would like these author responses to be offering as much information as they feel is important. And then I can use that to balance all the evidence to make a final recommendation. So it's unfortunate from my perspective that these have restrictions at all, but they're often there, and it's important to figure out how to navigate them. When you construct an author response, always be polite. You can be firm and direct, but you'll want to do that strategically to signal what you feel most strongly about. But fundamentally, you should never say things like this. Your inattentiveness is embarrassing. Section 6 does what you say we didn't do. You might privately say that to your co-authors as a kind of cathartic act of venting about how bad your reviews were, but you should never put it in an author response. Rather, you should do things that are more like, thank you. The information you're requesting is in section 6. We will make this more prominent in our revision. Fundamentally here, I think it's just important to be polite in these professional contexts, and it's a way to remind yourself that these reviewers did make an investment of their own time and intellectual energy into your work, and we want to be respectful and aware of that investment that they made. Presentation types and venues, there are lots of them. So first, there's the fundamental distinction. You might have either oral presentations or poster presentations, and cross-cutting that, you might think about submitting to a workshop or to a main conference. And here's a whole bunch of venues, and what I've done here is kind of organize this in a soft way. So on the left here, I have NLP conferences and workshops. I've put like what we consider the most prestigious 3 at the top here, ACL, NACL, and EMNLP, and then some other large ones just below that. Of course, the prestige order could really change here, so who knows what the next years will bring. For example, the Asia ACL is brand new, and of course, the number of people doing outstanding work in our area throughout Asia is enormous, and so it's very easy for me to imagine that AACL becomes at least as prominent, maybe even more prominent than some of these other ones up here over the next few years. And then we have some smaller and older conferences down here. And then, of course, at the bottom, I put workshops. All of these major conferences have workshop series attached to them. And workshops can be a great initial outlet for work you do, especially for a course like this. So I would encourage you for the major conferences to scan their program of workshops. And if you find one that's topically aligned with what you're working on, consider submitting to the workshop. It will probably be less competitive, so you have better chances of getting in. But I would say the more important thing is that it's a chance for you to actually connect with a community of people who are working on precisely the topic that you're working on. And that can be intellectually really exciting. In the middle here, I have some conferences that kind of run the spectrum from linguistics through the World Wide Web, through knowledge graphs, and kind of more core topics in artificial intelligence generally. And those can be really good outlets for work that has an NLP aspect to it. And then over here on the right, these are very prestigious machine learning conferences, and it's kind of the same story. All of these conferences here are welcoming of work that involves natural language processing, but you might just have to think about how you're going to precisely connect with these specific audiences and their specific concerns. Here's my personal assessment of NLP reviewing at present. First, I think the focus on conference papers as opposed to journals has been really good for NLP. It fits with and encourages the very rapid pace of our field, and I think we all benefit from that rapid pace overall. Before about 2010, the reviewing in the field was admirably good and rigorous in comparison with other fields. It really was impressive how many deep and insightful reviews you would get when you submitted to one of the main conferences in the field. Lately, though, the explosive growth of the field has, I think by consensus, reduced the general quality of reviewing, and the field is still grappling with this. Of course, there was always a kind of lottery aspect to whether your paper would be accepted, and you should keep in mind that luck is a real element in publication and throughout science. But that lottery aspect has gotten more amplified as the field has grown, and that's affecting the main conferences in ways that we all have to figure out. But again, this is kind of useful. Keep in mind that a rejection does not necessarily mean that your work was of low quality. It could mean that you just had really bad luck throughout a kind of chaotic reviewing process. I also want to say that I think it's unhealthy to force every paper to be 4 or 8 pages. The reason that happens is that there are 2 kinds of submission, typically a short paper, which has max length 4, and a long paper, which has max length 8. And we all, as submitters to one or another of those tracks, feel a kind of signaling pressure to maximize the available space. So there are like no 6-page papers in the field, and there's really no room to have papers that are longer than 8 pages. And that's unfortunate because sometimes you just need a different length than one of these to express your ideas in the best possible way. So that's been unhealthy. I will say, though, that this is alleviated somewhat by the increased use of appendices and supplementary materials to express a lot of details that don't need to be part of the main narrative. And that is in effect via a backdoor allowing papers to be of more variable length. The biggest failing to my mind of the conference reviewing process is that there's no revise and resubmit as you standardly get from journals. There's no chance for authors to appeal to an editor and interact with an editor in a way that you get from really top quality journals. And that just introduces inefficiency into the system, and it's a missed opportunity for intellectual engagement that could really benefit the work. I do want to say, though, there's hope. The Transactions of the ACL or TACL is a journal that follows the standard ACL conference model fairly closely, but allows for journal-style interaction with an editor. I'm conflicted here because I've been a TACL action editor for a very long time, but I do that work because I think TACL is wonderful. It's allowing for the best aspects of our field in terms of fast pace, while also introducing some healthy aspects of the journal reviewing process. TACL papers are a little bit longer at 10 pages, so there's still some of this problematic influence under 4 here, but at least they are a bit longer. And overall, I think it's just a healthier rhythm for thinking about evaluating work in these scientific contexts. So think about TACL as an outlet for your work as well. Let's focus on 2 more specific topics here, starting with titles. As I said before, a title is an important ingredient in the fate of your paper in conference reviewing. Jokey titles can be risky, and I've linked to some evidence for that down here in this paper. More importantly, you might think that it's important to calibrate the scope of your contribution in your title. It's a very common complaint from reviewers that the title is an overreach, that it claims a broader spectrum of the scientific space than the paper actually delivers on, and you want to avoid that by getting a tight alignment between title and paper. And then also consider the kinds of reviewers you're likely to attract during that bidding process. The choices you make in your title will definitely influence that process. And so you can, again, think strategically about who you want to pull in as a reviewer because of their interests and expertise and so forth. I would also say that it's worthwhile avoiding special fonts and formatting if possible, just because it makes it harder to consistently reproduce your title. That said, I am kind of charmed by the move to have emoji in titles recently. Jokey is risky, but this can be fun and make your paper a bit memorable, even if it is harder to copy and paste the title in various contexts. Abstracts. Abstracts are also incredibly important because after the title, they will create this first and lasting impression. So here's a suggestion about how to think about writing abstracts. It's a difficult form. First, have your opening be a broad overview, a glimpse at the central problem in its context. Next, the middle takes concepts mentioned in the opening and elaborates upon them, probably by connecting with specific experiments and results from your paper. And then finally, at the very end, establish links between your proposal and broader theoretical concerns so that the reviewer, on finishing this abstract, has an answer to the question, does the abstract offer a substantial and original proposal? So in a little more detail, here's a kind of meta abstract. This opening sentence situates you, dear reader. Our approach seeks to address the following central issue. You spell it out. The techniques we use are as follows, and you spell it out. Our experiments are these, details. And then finally, overall, we find that our approach has the following properties, and the significance of this is. And if you just fill in all those ellipsis dots, I think you're pretty close to an effective abstract. And that's at least a starting point for you when you think about maybe being more creative and fitting this better to the specifics of your ideas. Style sheets. This is small but important. This is the way that you could avoid the dreaded desk reject. Pay close attention to the details of the style sheet for your conference and any other requirements included in the call for papers. It is worth your while to read those documents carefully and make sure you've checked all the boxes. In NLP, infractions are the most likely cause of the dreaded desk reject. That is rejection without review, which is of course so disheartening because you made a big push to get your paper submitted, and then shortly thereafter you get this desk reject in the mail, and there's no recourse. That's pretty much the end of the process for you, and you can avoid it by just attending to what they've said in their style sheets and other guidelines. And then finally, we have this charming notion of a camera-ready version. This refers to old-fashioned technology for publishing papers where you actually needed to take pictures of documents in order to publish them. Those days are long gone, but the terminology remains. For most NLP conferences, as part of this, you get an additional page upon acceptance. This is presumably to respond to requests made by reviewers, although in practice, you're free to use the space however you like. In general, we find that the extra page is mainly used for fixing passages that we made overly terse at reviewing time in order to get into the page limits. And now we're kind of unpacking them to make them more readable. And this is obviously an inefficient process, but it's the reality at present. You could, of course, use your additional page to improve your results in all sorts of ways. It's entirely up to you. But a word of caution here, if you have very substantially new ideas and results, it might be better for you to save those for a follow-up paper, as opposed to trying to pack them into work that's already been accepted, right? Instead of just making more work for yourself as part of this first contribution, it might be that you're on the exciting path toward a follow-up contribution that's going to be its entirely own new paper. So think about that and balance these pressures, and then good luck with your camera-ready submissions.